I do think we will look back at the mass drugging of children as an evil act that will be looked back upon in history with shock. Hopefully the humanity evolves to the point where we can look back at this with shock and horror, and we could have courses on it, on how we can deteriorate as a culture to that extent. But Dr. Alan Francis was in a position of leadership. He could have done something about it. He oversaw bipolar 2 disorder, the diagnostic expansion of numerous conditions where we have really pathologized an entire subset of society. Bipolar for children really kind of grew in that era. Joseph Biederman, in my opinion, is a criminal. And so I just want to get your thoughts on Alan Francis, who seems to be lauded and put up today by people in this movement as if he has done something revolutionary.
Well, he's not lauded up in the world of Mad in America, which is like the go-to again for some of you folks who might not be aware of it. And that's the publication started by one of the best, I'd say the best journalists in America covering mental health, Robert Whitaker, and he has a great team over there too. And he's not lauded in the world of Mad in America for some of the reasons that you're talking. He's not lauded in the world of the International Society of Ethical Psychology and Psychiatry, which is a real critically thinking organization of dissonant mental health professionals. So for what you're saying, it looks like he's kind of a little Johnny come lately to the party here. And again, historically, I was mentioning, he's another one of these guys who it became clear at a certain point because of the hard work of people like Robert Whitaker and others, other dissonant psychiatrists, psychologists, people like Joanna Moncrief. We could talk about her. Psychiatrists have enormous respect for. I see you shaking your head. You do too. Because of that hard work, the needle has moved to the point where you just like a guy like Alan Francis. You get to be chair of the DSM-4 task force. How do you get to be that way? Well, the whole thing is bullshit. You get to move to that high level because you're a good politician. So anybody in a high level at the American Psychiatric Association is a good politician. And so a good politician, like Francis is, would recognize that this DSM-5 has become even more of a ridiculous joke. And by the way, too, there's other things why he started speaking out with his book, that he critical of the DSM-5 was that he was insulted that he was left out of the process. Mr. DSM-4 was left out of the DSM-5 process. So they shot back, and it's really funny politics. I cover this in the last book, and the real funny politics. So the big shots who were head of this DSM-5 Bible, they started making fun of Alan Francis as well. You're just pissed off because you're going to lose your royalty from DSM-4. That's why you're pissed off at DSM-5. So it's really funny. You get some truths listening to these infighting, among each other. And just like listening to some, primary, some sort of debate among the Republicans or Democrats, all you get are you do hear some truths about the other side and this stuff. So that's what happens. But yeah, your general point is the guy's pretty late to the party. You weren't 20 years old here when you were putting your rubber stamp on this bullshit DSM-4 here that was pathologizing more and more people here. You were already pretty mature guys, very older than you. And it's and it's now because the politics has shifted, you're going to try to get this book out there and be this apostate psychiatrist here. Well, it's a little too late and not too little and too late. So he's, I'm glad he's out there because it's fun to use some Alan Francis quotes. He calls, I use one of his quotes in that last book where he basically says mental disorders are bullshit. And so for me, it's a useful thing when I go on and I do a show like this to the general public and I say, look, this is not just a guy like Roger, a guy like Bruce Levine or Robert Whitaker or Joanna Moncrief. This is establishment psychiatry. You can't be more of an insider establishment psychiatry than Alan Francis, and he's calling these diagnoses, he used the word bullshit. And so it's helpful for me in that sense, but other than that, he's of no value to me.
Speaking of mainstream psychiatry, and this was a quote in your May 5th article of this past year, once radical critiques of psychiatry are now mainstream, so what remains taboo? And this is in the counterpunch. In 2011, Thomas Insel, who's the director of the National Institute of Mental Health from 2002 to 2015, acknowledged, whatever we've been doing for 5 decades, it ain't working. When I look at the numbers, the number of suicides, the number of disabilities, The mortality data, it's abysmal, and it's not getting any better. In 2017, Insel told Wired, I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realized that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at a fairly large cost, I think 20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I'll go a step further. Move the needle. It's gotten worse. It has gotten substantially worse. And if we do think that it's starting to change and we're able to have conversations like this, it is not being able to make a difference with the general public. We have more and more people attaching the psychiatric labels as if they're legitimate and discrete medical illnesses. We have more people going on psychiatric drugs, including young people. Everything is getting worse. In a recent survey, 85% of people still believe in a chemical imbalance theory of mental illness. And so my question for you, Dr. Levine, is given this, right? Even when mainstream psychiatry has spoken out against the harms, how does this continue to be the dominant narrative in healthcare in the United States?
Well, that's a question that I spent a lot of time on, thinking about. And, the obvious simple things, and I won't spend a lot of time on it because they're just obvious reasons. I mean, is once psychiatry went to bat, once they were in trouble in the 70s, their way of getting out, since they had no science, the only way political solution for them was to team up with drug companies. And they actually talk about it. They don't hide this. I have quotes where their medical director in the 1908 American Psychiatric Association brags about their partnership with drug companies. So drug companies have an enormous amount of money. I mean, it's just hard for people to grasp. I mean, this just got ridiculous after the SSRIs. Each one of these, drugs like Prozac, like $20 billion after it's been out for 15, 20 years. And there's just a incredible amount of money these drug companies were making once they started teaming up with psychiatry. And that allows these drug companies to spread that money around. You mentioned Biederman before, Joseph Biederman, who recently died, and I guess he's not going to be creating any more childhood psychiatric disorders, but he's the father of this idiotic thing called pediatric bipolar disorder, juvenile bipolar disorder, with crazy symptoms. 3-4-year-olds getting diagnosed with like this bipolar disorder because they're intensely silly and happy, or they talk too fast, or I mean, you're talking about 3-4-year-old. This is insanity, right? And so, but he, in the congressional hearings in 2008, they exposed him to having taken $1.6 million from Johnson & Johnson, or from drug companies in general, a lot of it for Johnson & Johnson because he was pushing Risperdal. And so there were other big shot psychiatrists who were taking tons of money. So there's a psychiatric pharmaceutical-industrial complex where these pharmaceutical companies spread their money around and to these big thought leader psychiatrists. And then the other thing that happens, maybe more to your point, is that once these drug commercials became legal, which happened in the late 1990s. Again, these drug companies had so much power to control these politicians to allow these commercials to be on TV. When I was a kid, you'd never see psychiatric drug or any drug commercials on television. But once those got on television and on magazines, and once you have this, what they call direct-to-consumer advertising, then all of a sudden, what happens? The major media, these who are dependent on these advertising dollars, they don't want to get these drug companies upset. You think they're going to run too critical a story on Pfizer or Eli Lilly or Johnson & Johnson, and these guys are going to just say, hey, I guess we'll put our advertising somewhere else. Sorry, buddy. And so they know that. So that's what they've been able to do. So their drug companies, there are a lot of things, but they are certainly not stupid. And they realize, just again, it's an old playbook. If you have a lot of money, if you're making billions and billions, you spread $1 million here, you spread $1 million there, and so you have control. But there's bigger pieces to this picture that I talk about in a, more recently, is like what else retains this thing. So there's other, besides these direct financial obvious reasons, there's big political reasons that a society in general doesn't want to deal with this. So one of the things is that if you're at the very top of the heap, the ruling class, the powers that shouldn't be, whatever you want to call it. These, the guys at the 1/10 of 1%, they like the way society's functioning. They're those diseases of despair, like they're not, nobody's like, in their little world killing themselves because they can't pay their bills. And, they like the way the thing's running. They want to maintain the status quo. Let's just put it that way. And so if you're on the top of any kind of ruling class elite, what you want is people to believe that their emotional suffering, their anxiety, their depression, their substance abuse, their suicidality, that it has to do with some individual defect. Now, the top of the heap, the ruling class, they don't care what mumbo jumbo bullshit psychiatry comes up with, whether it's a biochemical imbalance theory, or now Thomas Insull's switching, finally admitting, oh yeah, I guess there is no biochemical imbalance theory. So he's switching to some electrical circuitry theory. And, if you read his 2022 book, he's talking about electroshock not being used enough. I mean, it's pretty scary. But I mean, so they don't care, though, at the top of the heap. They don't care whatever, they come up with, as long as it's some individual defect. And this is very similar. That's one of the reasons I talk about with the Spinoza era 350 years ago. There was a symbiotic relationship between monarchy and the organized religion, that the people who were the monarchs like to have these folks who are these ecclesiastic clergy authorities who are telling people, well, the reason why you're miserable is you're not going to church enough. Not because you have no money and you have no political power.